Developing a new CX solution for your company can take some time, but does it really have to?
So we actually spent a 3.5-day period where we applied the sprint approach. We defined our target goal as a team, decided on the best idea, built a prototype, tested it with multiple customers. I think what we had at the end of the 4th day was definitely listening architecture strategy and execution plan that was vetted by those customers and employees.
Using the sprint development model to supercharge your CX innovation on this episode of the CX Leader Podcast.
The CX Leader Podcast with Steve Walker is produced by Walker, a business consulting firm that helps our clients unlock the potential of their customer experiences by placing the customer at the heart of all their business decisions. You can find out more at walkerinfo.com.
Hello, I'm Steve Walker, Chairman and CEO of Walker Information, and also the host of the CX Leader Podcast, your source for everything you need to develop your skills as a CX leader. Our CX Leader Podcast explores the topics that are important to you and help you leverage all the benefits of your customer experience. And this helps your customers and prospects want to do more business with you. This is our second in a 3-part series on our Change Management series. In our last podcast, we learned that CX leaders need to drive action in their organization to create effective and lasting change. But it takes time to make changes in an organization. Well, that doesn't have to be the reality. Software companies have been using methods for rapid product development for years. And my guest on this episode is going to tell us how CX teams can use the sprint development model in their CX programs. Jack Walker is a consultant here at Walker, and he's going to tell us how he's helped companies apply sprint to their customer experience programs. Jack, welcome to the CX Leader Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Nice to have you. You're a first-time guest, but a long-time listener, I assume.
That's right.
Well, last week, our colleague Noah gave us a brief overview on how we've leveraged a book called Sprint to tackle CX change management initiatives. I understand that you were on the first team to apply it with one of our clients. How about you walk us through that and just show how we use the sprint and how it can be used for CX change management?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually the idea to apply sprint to CX change management design actually came to us from our talented customer, Cisco Foods. Specifically Brian Beach, who is their Senior Vice President of Cisco Labs and Customer Experience. Brian's a real visionary, and he's always challenging the status quo in terms of the way business is done and how business processes should be designed. So he told us that he'd been reading this book called Sprint, which lays out a design thinking framework to take an idea to prototype in 5 days. And given that we were starting to work with his team on redesigning Cisco's customer listening architecture, he suggested that we try this sprint process out for that effort. So we did. It worked out great, and we went on to replicate it now with a handful of other customers and have gotten a lot of great feedback from participants on it. So give that, that early success, we felt it was the right time to share it with our CX Leader podcast audience to see if it could be another useful tool that they should consider for their CX change management initiatives.
Excellent. Now, Noah last week provided us a breakdown on the 5 stages of a sprint process. Why don't you take some time and just remind our listeners of the 5 steps and give us a little more detail and then maybe even apply it to how it might be used for changing your CX experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's important before we continue on our discussion here. So Sprint is a book that came out a couple years ago. It was written by a guy named Jake Knapp, who is a former Google Ventures employee, where they kind of really utilized this sprint process there on a lot of design thinking work at Google Ventures. The sprint model is an innovation process that really takes an idea to prototype in a few days instead of months. A lot of our listeners out there have probably heard of this kind of approach from your techie friends, but it's useful for CX leaders too. We've found that to be the case for sure. So the sprint process calls for locking basically 5 to 7 people in a room, or a 2 pizza team, as they like to call it, for a couple days and really going through 5 stages of their design process. And those are map, sketch, decide, prototype, and test. The first phase, or map, is all about laying it out on the table, or better yet, I should say, like all out on the wall. There's a heavy use of sticky notes and structured exercises that help bring all of the information known about the problem to the surface. All those sticky notes are placed on a wall to really visually present all of the data collected from personal experiences or expert interviews that have been conducted with customers or internal folks prior to or during this phase. And by the end of the mapping stage, the group kind of can consider all the information available before picking a target to focus on for the remainder of the sprint. So that's the first phase. The second phase you move into is called sketch, and this won't be liked for people that get anxiety for having to use their drawing skills, but too bad for them.
I'd be out on that
Yeah.
one.
So it's not art school, this is business, and we're trying to solve customer problems, but all kidding aside, this phase is all about eliminating group thinking by first having everyone work individually to come up with a proposed solution to the problem based on the information that was collected in that mapping, or phase 1. And then after that, take all those individual sketches, and phase 3 is the decide phase. So it's a group exercise where individual solutions are presented and debated among the group before ultimately combining the best thoughts and ideas into a decision on the sketch that should be prototyped and tested. So then that leads to stage 4, or prototype, where the group will get creative and artistic again in creating an actual prototype of their solution. And it actually does mean sometimes creating a physical representation of your solution, because it's going to be useful in stage 5 when you're actually going out and testing it with real customers and internal employees to get real feedback, quick and honest, straight feedback from customers and employees on the most important questions to help you aid in readying the solution for go-to-market.
So it's all the way from problem statement to concept to actual field testing with customers in a week.
That's right. It's hard to believe. And when you get everybody in the room and we say we're going to accomplish that, there's some kind of rolling of the eyes, but it's pretty amazing if you stick to the process, stay disciplined, stick to a lot of the rules they set out of moving quickly, not debating and getting down a lot of rabbit holes. You really can get there.
Yeah, and the concept of the two-pizza team calls to mind something I've thought of throughout my career, which is that all of us are collectively smarter than any one of us.
That's right.
And I think sometimes CX leaders feel like they're kind of an island, but this is really a way to engage and involve some other people.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's important, especially for a good outcome, that the team that is assembled for this is very cross-functional, that you're bringing in a lot of different people throughout the organization that affect this ultimate problem that you're trying to solve. So the best ideas come to the table, diverse thinking, and ultimately, the best solution.
Well, you've laid it out, and we've talked a little bit about how you got involved in this. Why don't you give us a practical example, or maybe if you could even share how you actually use this at Cisco for their CX listening architecture?
Yeah, well, let's talk about that Cisco example. So obviously, we work with Cisco Food's Customer Insights team, and they're charged with bringing the customer voice to life for the organization. Like all CX functions, Cisco's CX leaders have to work cross-functionally, just like we were talking about, within the company to satisfy the needs and create buy-in from all stakeholders. So instead of doing that annual planning the same way we've always done, again, Brian was challenging us to use this sprint process to the table to redesign their customer listening architecture to help optimize the impact for the business. So we actually spent a 3.5-day period where we applied the sprint approach. We mapped out all of the customer insight needs from the company after speaking to various stakeholders throughout the company who obviously care about this work. We defined our target goal as a team after laying all that out there and mapping it on the board, sketched competing ideas. We collaborated and decided on the best idea, built a prototype, and yes, on that last day, we did test it with multiple customers in a live setting, as well as dozens of employees. And I think what we had at the end of the 4th day was definitely a listening architecture strategy and execution plan that was vetted by those customers and employees. And the cool thing about it is ready to start executing on that next week.
Yeah, quick wins are so important in change management.
Yeah.
My guest today is Jack Walker, a consultant here at Walker, and we're in the second part of a 3-part series on how CX leaders can leverage change management activities to accelerate their positive change in their programs. Jack, now let's turn more specifically to the CX leaders, and how could they decide when applying a sprint methodology might be appropriate?
Yeah. So I don't know about you, but I think we've probably all experienced this idea of death by meeting, especially for initiatives that take a lot of different people throughout the organization that have to be involved to come up with a new idea. Oftentimes, you can have these cross-functional meetings that span months and months and months, and really little is accomplished. You have to backtrack each time you meet to kind of remind everybody on the team what was discussed and where we're at now. And it's just an everlasting cycle that you feel like you really never get anywhere. So this is a great application. It's a practical application. It's not just philosophy. It's an actual framework that's laid out in this book that kind of can take you through accelerating that time to change. So I think if you're trying to avoid that death by meeting, this is a great framework to apply for that. Some use cases I think that Sprint can very well be applied to. It fits with some of the topics we've talked about recently on the CX Leader podcast. So for journey mapping, we talked a lot about those roadblocks where you've done all this work, but kind of it's hard or you neglect to go the distance with what insights came out of that journey mapping work. So this is a great exercise to really capitalize on the momentum that comes out of that journey mapping work to get right to it and come up with a solution right away. Obviously, the second thing, we've talked a lot about it so far here in this podcast, the listening architecture example. So listening architecture, voice of the customer, is definitely a business function or process that a lot of people in the organization have a vested interest in. So getting a lot of key stakeholders together, this is a great way to facilitate that. And then thirdly, I think, just refreshing a stage in the customer journey. I think a great example of that, and something that we've done with another company, is just being able to redesign the new customer onboarding process. So you can start to think how something like this can be helpful to quickly coming up with a new customer onboarding process through this type of a work.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about the death by meetings, and as someone going on 40 years in business, I can assure you that I've wasted a lot of time in meetings. But it seems to me like one of the big barriers would be getting the commitment of people to focus over multiple days. But listening to you, I'm thinking that in the long term there's going to be a payback on this. But just for our listeners who are intrigued by this concept, what are some tips you might give them for justifying the commitment of time and energy to this?
Yeah. The commitment and the ask of the individuals that are going to participate in this, it is a major ask. And, the book calls for 5 full days to go through this process. I would challenge that a little bit and say, I think we've found success in slimming it down to 2 or 3 days at sometimes, and it really just depends on the complexity of the problem. But I think for CX leaders who are trying, who like this idea and would want to test it out, I would advise them to really try to focus on maybe some low-hanging fruit first to prove out the process. So something that could be easily accomplished in like 1 to 2 days before tackling a larger problem that would necessitate a 4 or 5 day ask of people's time. So I think that could be an important way to think about it, to generate some buy-in. Because I think what we've seen as people even skeptical to participate in past work that we've done with other companies, when they get through the couple of days in the process, we've heard multiple comments of, that's the best use of my time in the past 10 years that I've been at this company. So I think that'd be a way to introduce it into your company.
Awesome.
Yeah. What
What are some of the other barriers or obstacles that CX leaders might want to anticipate if they go into this?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of really key elements here to make sure that success happens of this. So number one, I think getting the right people involved is critically important. So you can't just have everybody from the team and everybody and work with on a daily basis in this thing. You need to have a real cross-functional team from various functions of the organization. It's important that these folks that are invited to the meeting have respect in the organization, because ultimately what comes out of this couple-day period that you design a new process or a new product, you've vetted it out with customers. You're going to want to have the people that spent time developing the solution to have that respect that this new process can be adopted by the rest of the organization, and more resources should be put into it to make it a success. So I think that's one thing. And then secondly, I think everyone adhering to the time commitment and rules is important too. So it's easy for us to, when we get in there, to look at our cell phones or have our laptop up, checking emails, and the process does lay out breaks to try to check in on that kind of stuff. But with how jam-packed the week is, it really is about staying disciplined about that kind of stuff.
Great. Jack Walker's a consultant here at Walker, and he's talking to us about how you can apply a sprint process to rapidly develop your CX program. Jack, any final thoughts on the topic? Anything else we didn't cover that you wanted to get in there?
Well, I just think that, I don't know if just listening to me and kind of what Noah had spoke about last week, if you listen to that podcast, if any of this scares you, it scared me too when I first heard of the idea. But Having gone through it now multiple times, I really do see the value in it. And especially kind of going back to overcoming those early barriers, if you can really focus on some low-hanging fruit to test out this methodology and this framework and see if it's going to be useful for your organization, this really can be a powerful tool to accelerating the time to value you get out of your CX program.
And if any of our listeners would like to follow up with you, can you just tell them how they might be able to get a hold of you real quick?
Absolutely. So probably best way to get a hold of me is by email. My email is jwalker@walkerinfo.com. That makes it easy. And connect with me on LinkedIn or however. So I look forward to speaking with anybody who wants to continue the discussion.
Jack Walker's been our guest, and he's a consultant here at Walker and talking about the sprint process. Jack, thanks for being on the CX Leader podcast. Hope to have you back again.
Thanks for having me.
If you want to talk about anything we discussed or how Walker can help your business customer experience, you can contact me at steve.walker@walkerinformation.com or call me here in the U.S. at 1-317-843-8890. Don't hesitate to reach out to me, Jack, or any of the other great people here at Walker. We'd love to talk to you more about your plans for your CX program. We recently hosted a webcast on change management where Jack, along with last week's episode's guest, Noah Grayson, and I, discussed change management and how you can drive action and apply the sprint process to your CX efforts. Check out our show notes page for a link to the recording of that webcast. And don't forget to subscribe to the CX Leader podcast. You can go to walkerinfo.com/podcasts and you'll find links to iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Play. And we've started posting our podcast to our YouTube channel as well. You can find it at youtube.com/walkerinformation. Thanks to all our listeners for helping us get onto all these platforms. It's really been a gratifying thing for us that we started this less than a year ago, and we continue to see increasing interest and commitment and followership. So thank you very much. Thanks for listening to this episode. We'll be looking forward to having you back again next week. The CX Leader podcast is a production of Walker. We're a business consulting firm that can help you make customer experience your biggest competitive advantage. Find out more at walkerinfo.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.